Hey everyone, welcome. We have our, I don't know what number this is, fifth, sixth Q&A session with previous guests of the Future Thinkers podcast. Today we have Jamie Wheal on. Jamie is a researcher and writer in the field of human potential, peak performance, and flow states. He's the co-author of the book Stealing Fire and director of the Flow Genome Project. This stream is for members of our community. If you want to join future streams, you can check that out at members.futurethinkers.org. This is just going to be a kind of a free-flowing conversation. We have sort of pre-prepped some questions and stuff, but we're going to kind of throw it out there and see where this goes. I think this group has a pretty good kind of collective intelligence ability, so we're just going to throw it out there. And we're going to, if I can make a request to people in the chat, or in this group, if anyone wants to kind of check out the chat and kind of follow along, there's often like a really lot of good contributions in there. So I know David, you're always looking at that. If we can kind of drop in some questions here and there from the chat, if they're really compelling, then let's do that. This is the first time as well that we're streaming on both YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. If you guys are watching on Twitch or Facebook, please jump into the YouTube stream if you want to contribute in the chat. And that is at futurethinkers.org/Q and the little and symbol A. And that'll forward you to the YouTube page. Let me make sure this is all good to go.
And
we're live.
if afterwards you guys want to check out our interview that we did with Jamie, it's futurethinkers.org/100.
Awesome. So, Jamie, welcome. Good to have you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
I think there's been a lot of anticipation for this call, so it's exciting that you're here and that you've taken the time to do this with us. As I usually do in some of these calls, when I'm handling a lot of the tech setup, I kind of throw it to David. So, David, you want to go into your first question here?
Sure. Let's see. I'm gonna look up my question because I just remind myself what I was asking. So the main thing is I've been following you for a long time, and one of the things that you've been noting is the breakdown in sense making. You're one of the people that has been talking about this for a while. One of the leaders in thinking about this, and catching up on some of the videos that you've done recently. It's clear that it's getting worse. Coronavirus is like one of those things that's very much a challenge to our existing sense making. One of the things that I really like is with the flow genome, the way that you look at flow is a way for an individual to build coherence over time. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is collective flow. And how do we build coherence collectively? And coronavirus is one of those things like this is a real-time, interesting test case for how we do that. So far, we don't seem to be doing all that well with it. But I'm curious if you have thoughts about ways that we can build coherence, like rather than pushing the string and making it all bundled, actually build something that is a coherent pull to pull some sense making in from the collective. Does that question make sense?
All of it except that last half a sentence. So do you want me to focus specifically on coronavirus, or do you want me to actually kind of pan back a little bit and talk about kind of structural ways of how do humans get together and do hard things well?
I'd like to focus on coronavirus and kind of what you're noticing with that, kind of the way that we're currently challenged with collective sense making, how individuals can collaborate. Actually, one of the things I'll say about it is that in the game of telephone, it has historically been the case that signal degrades over time. And that with a kind of an anti-fragile model, something like I want the collective to make the signal stronger in a game where we're actually talking to our peers rather than orienting to the official main conversation. And that's a real interesting distinction, a challenge that we haven't really faced before, but this is like a perfect opportunity to do that. So that's kind of the sense of how coronavirus informs how do we do peer-to-peer communication in a way that actually enhances signal. Does that help?
Sure, and I may just kind of veer off a little bit, but so I mean, my first sense is that, the last few weeks of trying to figure out what's going on in the world, what are the implications, what's some of the data, how predictive can we be about viral outbreaks, cascade impacts into supply chains, macroeconomics, geopolitics, etc. I don't know about you guys, but I imagine your social feeds are similar to mine, and I'm actually finding quite a bit of collective sense making and quite a bit of deferring to independent but credible voices. So like, hey, I have a friend in the CDC. This is what they're saying. Hey, we have an epidemiologist who's at Harvard and Stanford. They're working with the WHO. This is what they're saying. Twitter is great for that kind of sorting and selecting and signal boosting. And I mean, honestly, given that a global pandemic with questionable are not values and questionable nation state information and data sharing, as always, will and always be a shit show. And in some respects, the way things are being shared, the rapid prototyping of vaccines, the disclosure of information, you could make a case we're actually doing a decent fire drill job right now with no manual. And that's not to say it's perfect, and that's not to say it's adequate. It's just to say people are trying and things are happening. So in that respect, I would say, potentially the response to coronavirus in the sense of, hey, there's potentially severe impact. There is obviously an interconnectivity to our sort of where we go one, where we go all, right? Results. In some respects, I would say this is a messy example of spontaneous moving in the right direction, and TBD on how it all plays out, right? It may get in the ditch, but compared to the first half of your question, which is how do we make sense in uncertain times, and then how do we play well together and come to functional consensus around that? To me, absent a big meta threat, like let's put Corona in that at least provisional bucket. That's the one that seems more problematic. People go to false certainty. They go to entrenched positions. They do a lot of pissing match kind of stuff, and then very quickly you're down the rhetorical pyramid. You're into ad hominems. You're into missing, not refuting central arguments, not coming facts with facts, and even in some of our shared and overlapping communities, I think there's an awful lot of like a disappointing amount of that, where you're like, oh God, we're supposed to be on the same team. Everybody's opted into this Facebook group or this community or whatever it would be. And surely we should be able to play decently with each other, because the whole fucking point of this community is figuring out how to play decently. So for me, on the collective sense making, there is a model, and this is not fancy, this is dead simple, but this is just somebody asked me, how do I make sense of things? And it was literally in this realm, it was to do with psychedelics and non-ordinary experiences, but it also holds for X-risk mapping and modeling. It holds for anything that is complex, chaotic, interdependent, and not entirely certain. So for me, there's a triangle of, first is Pascal's wager, right? Better to consider this black swan possibility, whether it's mystical, non-ordinary, or whether it's existential and potentially cataclysmic, better to consider it than not, just in case. Then Occam's razor, like, let's not subscribe to overly complicated reasoning when there could just be a simple one. The idea of like never chalk up to malice what could be ascribed to incompetence, right? Or I was just on drugs, right? A number of things, but Occam's razor, like whittle that shit down to the minimum viable philosophy. And then finally, kind of for the base, Bayesian analysis, which is complex interdependent variables, can't tell from here, let's not get out over our skis, and let's dynamically weight things over time as we see them unfold. And you can kind of run through that filter system, and it more or less, and then, as I get more data hits, as I get more confirmation, I can go from hypothesis to theorem to law. Hypothesis, don't know, I'm asking and I'm paying acute attention, and this is not solid enough to wait. Theorem, it's not exclusively always true, but it appears to be true enough, often enough, that I can use it as a tool. To law, this I can actually fully trust. And so that kind of sliding ontological scale of sort of three buckets, like what I was told in grade school and Sunday school, those are the laws. What I've experienced, that is conjectural, hypothetical. It's quite possibly I've experienced it. And again, you could use this in mystical psychedelic experiences, but I don't change my name. I don't quit my day job. I keep that up on the shelf under consideration of like, maybe the world is weirder and stranger and more alive than I thought. And then bucket number 3 is purely the hypothetical. That's the red pill nature of the woods. If so, then what? Right? Like if bucket 3 stuff is true, then my entire cascade underneath it is revised substantially. And how do I hold those 3 ontological buckets? Right? And how do I play with them dynamically using that triangle of Pascal, Occam, and Bayes? And I just play the game of over time, I can move things from bucket number 2, that's some far out shit, I've experienced it, but I'm not willing to bet the farm on it, into bucket number 1, I've had it enough, I can begin to rely on it, bucket number 3 to bucket number 2, or vice versa. So that's my sense on sense making in dynamic, chaotic, unstable conditions that effectively are breaking post-enlightenment 5 sense and binary logical empiricism. So let me stop there, because I'm going to transition then into the group coherence thing. But how does that track for you, David, and any other questions on that?
Yeah, it's really good. Actually, in the conversation that you had on the Future Thinkers call, one of the things the 3 things that you mentioned that were really interesting is sense making can be challenging when there's confusing information, multiple conflicting data points. The kind of resistance to sacrificing sacred cows, and the sense that we can't metabolize our grief effectively.
Yeah.
So those 3 things can, in a way, cloud our ability to go through that triangle.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not careful, we can go towards foolishness rather than towards wisdom if we don't have the right kind of feedback mechanisms to check the things that we're putting into that 3-sided triangle. So that's informed by my sense of watching John Vervaeke, but that, I'm curious about that sense of, that's an excellent model. And there's kind of a part B of how does one check their own sense of the use of that model to make sure they're not going in the wrong direction and heading in the right direction. And so that's kind of the follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, my bottom line is that exactly how you guys are doing it, which is establishing relationship in a high trust, low friction environment and kicking stuff around together. I mean, the dialectic, right, is how we do make meaning and how we kind of pressure test our ideas. Particularly around the notion of sacred cows. I'll share one that I've had to put a bullet in lately, which is the notion, if you haven't read Black Mass and the Death of Utopia, that John Gray book, he's at the London School of Economics, and he's a professor of European philosophy. And he wrote it in 2008, so it was really a critique of like neocon invasion of the Middle East, Arab Spring kind of stuff, but he contextualizes it very deeply on either end of it. And his basic argument is all of politics is just a footnote in the larger history of religion, and that we are in the throes of constant utopian ideologies that go all the way back to the Judeo-Christian Alpha Omega, right? The collapsing of circular time into linear time, the fact that mankind is suffering, but it's not due to his fault, it's due to some fall or aberration, and whether that's in communism, right? It's the market and the capitalist pushing down the proletariat. Judeo-Christian, it's some version of original sin, but man, everywhere is in chains. There is something beautiful to happen soon, right? The redemption, and then they will live in perfection. And so his point was communism, neoliberalism, you could add psychedelic renaissance, you could add cryptocurrency and blockchain revolution. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, is that pretty much all of our Western narratives are hockey stick redemption curves to some idealized end state. And not surprising, this is kind of where Jordan Peterson went apeshit, on intersectionality being a slippery slide to Stalinist death camps. And I think he got a little overclocked on that one. But the premise is, when the ends are literally paradise on earth, the means are always justified, always. And that's including SJWs being absolutely horrendous to other humans as humans on behalf of humanity, things like that. And you're like, oh shit. maybe what we're seeing here is this arc that looks like a hockey stick curved to redemption for everybody's narratives these days, including Game B, including any of these things. You're like, is that, if we pan back, is that not just part of a circle? And so as time's arrow, as often as not, Ouroboros, the snake that eats its tail. And are we actually any further along than the ancient Greeks, than many indigenous societies, than 100 human expressions that have bubbled up in complexity, in consciousness, in humanitarianism, in adaptability, anti-fragility, and have then been buried and plowed under? Or are we truly on some frothy leading edge? And Ken Wilber was a huge shot in the arm of kind of going against retro-romanticism, of looking back, oh, the noble savage, oh, we were cast out of the garden. He was saying, no, progressive evolutionary development. And I think that was a really strong shot of this DNA in the last 20 to 30 years. But it's a question. Like, are we sure? Are we sure we're on the pinnacle of development? Because, the case that John Gray makes in this book is he's like, look, modern Iran is a modern society. China is a modern society. North Korea is a modern society. We don't get to do the Francis Fukuyama and just pick and choose and go, hey, free market neoliberal democracy is the pinnacle of human civilization. Everything else that's co-arising is an aberration and is actually not the real thing. But this is the thing. Yay. It's like, well, actually, look, it's all emerging. And so his point is actually that there isn't going to be a neoliberal pinnacle of anything. And that agonistic liberalism, the idea of like smashing and bashing heads, we're never going to get to someone's got the talking stick and we all agree. And agonistic liberalism is to say we're always going to be in this rivalrous competition of ideas that, with precedence and demotion. And let's wrap our heads around it. So in that respect, that's a socio-political analysis that is very comparable to sort of Pema Chodron. Like that we create more suffering when we fail to just recognize what is. And that our redemption lies in an actual embrace of all of reality without struggling so much against it. So for me, that's a huge sacred cow. I've had to shoot, or if not shoot, at least tranquilize for like the last couple of months. And I'm still mulling the implications of it. And of course, it's not to say, oh, linear time, time's arrow, bad. Circular time, indigenous, close to the earth, good. Is to say, in fact, time is probably like block time, right? And it depends. Wave particle, how the lens we lay over it fundamentally determines what we see about it, what we see about its causation and implications. So for me right now, as all of us are trying to figure out, what do we do now? Right? Isn't that like that's the fundamental question? People are waking up to higher levels of expanded awareness all around the world at scale in ways possibly, unprecedented. But as we all do it, we're like, what do we do now? Because there's these two intersecting arcs. There's the arc of coming alive, the kind of perennial, what is the good life, right? And then there's the arc of staying alive, like, oh shit, like we might be out of time, and the questions I'm asking and the answers I'm coming to on the coming alive, what is the fullest flourishing of human being that I can come up with, is now intersecting with existential risk triage. And that's a mind fuck. And so the more and more that's hard, the harder and harder that problem is to pencil out and solve, the stronger the impetus is to make the dynamic, like a rock climber, like a dino, like just a lunge and a leap to the rapture outcome, to the eschaton play. Because if I can't solve this messy middle, my temptation to believe that it all comes up roses on the far side of a keyhole event, eschatological or biological, right, becomes increasingly high. Because if I can't figure out the cognitive dissonance in between, and I'm not sure that me and mine are going to be safe and cared for, then assigning some redemption narrative to me and mine, however we stack and sort that, is increasingly strong. So I'll stop there. That was a ton of info, but and somebody I think in the comments had just said, what was the name? Yeah, Black Mass is the name of that John Gray book.
I don't want to bogart the whole microphone right now, but I do want to look at the micro scale, looking at right now. One of the things, I know you're in Austin, I'm in Austin. one of the things that's for consideration right now is the consideration of whether or not South by Southwest should be canceled. Huge conference, a lot of people coming to town. The concern is, oh, you might be bringing a lot of people from various countries into a tight community of people over a 14-day, 15-day period. Does that actually increase the risk, or is canceling it kind of prematurely panicking? So there's something like, I don't want to stick my head in the sand and just be an idiot about it. At the same time, I don't want to prematurely just raise a panic and cause all kinds of financial things. But that's one of those kinds of sacred cow moments of how do we actually consider the reality and the risk reward, the negative consequences versus the positive potential benefit of reducing that. And so that's, it's not so much the answer to that question, but the way to approach that question, and whether or not the organizers are thinking more financially or more in long-term health, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, we talked a little bit before we went live about how a number of people are playing in that 20,000 foot to 100,000 foot range of like, what's hypothetical, what's possible, what's ideal versus the 20,000 to the deck. And my sense is that, a huge number of people's philosophies are just about to get boom in the face of reality, which is actually, for me, profoundly refreshing. Not that it's going to be fun, but it is at least what it is. And so the idea of like, is the macroeconomic collapse due because I'm a libertarian and see, I told you so, or I'm a democratic socialist and this is just proof of, or it's like, none of it's going to matter. And so the reality is coronavirus the world-ending Black Plague that Stephen King wrote about in The Stand? No, probably not. Is Donald Trump the end of civilization? No, probably not. But they are quite likely harbingers of things to come that might be. And as dress rehearsals, they are stress testing our systems and everything to do with decision-making, collective mobilization, pattern recognition, what the fuck, everything. And what we're seeing is like, it is what it is. It is what it is that people are making premature, fear-based, control decisions. It is what it is that people are acting, impulsively on partial information. There's 1,000, risk mitigation, you name it. It's all happening as people do stuff. And so constantly going back to, and this is, back to that John Gray thing, constantly like denying reality as it's happening for a preferred, more idealistic version of what ought to be happening seems to be increasingly batshit to me. My background is in like mountain guiding and like backcountry kind of stuff. So like, not unlike like special operations kind of thing. You're just dealing with reality. And so like if an avalanche peels off up above them, above us on a mountain, and we're like, run like hell to hide behind that rock. We're not strolling along the way pontificating on whether we think it's geological or geographic warming or solar flares, or a recent weather event that prompted that thing to pop loose. We're like, there's a fucking avalanche, and if we don't hide behind this rock, none of us have the luxury to debate causation. And so my sense is we're just moving into a real-time, hyper-pragmatic phase. Where it's Shakespeare 101, there's more on heaven and earth Horatio than our philosophies. And in that respect, for anybody who's still philosophizing, especially around, we have some friends who are super duper crazy smart, who are woodshedding right now on reinventing global governance, which on the one hand sounds like a noble idea. And on the other hand, it's like, we can't even fucking get rid of the electoral college. So like the idea of like injecting ex nihilo, out of the void, some perfected thing is once again back to that utopian thinking trap. So the moment you catch that and you're like, what are we doing? Why aren't we just here dealing with what is and taking the next agonistic step? We're not waiting for kumbaya agreement. We're not presuming there's ever going to be a perfect lie of the ball. We're just going to move forward. I was just with some of the guys from the Founders Fund at a dinner in Austin, and they were discussing, libertarian ideals and philosophies, and the idea of like privatizing the military and some, really questionable, you're like, Blackwater much like these guys were just so idealistic. And it's like, look, if you think that the way things are, the state of things is insufficient, inadequate, imperfect, corrupt, broken, And you can't actually add or insert your ideological solution into the stream of realpolitik, then you are implicitly or explicitly banking on collapse of this system so that you can then do your ideal or preferred thing. And for anybody that thinks this system can collapse and that you are still going to have a reasonable, fair shot at the T is ludicrous. It's adolescent, boyish thinking left over from Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I'm going to be the master of my own universe. Like, I'm the dungeon master. No, you're not. You're going to be hiding in your basement. And so the idea that like anybody who is banking on the collapse of this system so that their system can actually finally get the chance to prove everybody wrong is, I think, ludicrously naive. So I just think that, yeah, I mean, to sum it all up, back to South by Southwest and Austin Choices and those kind of things, I just think it is what it is. And paying attention and adapting to real-time on the ground realities is a skill set that many of us have sort of let atrophy based on excess wonky knowledge work, seamlessly integrated one-day prime shipping global supply chains. Like, we're just passive zoo animals. And getting real again, which, by the way, I think is if you look at the phenomenon of CrossFit, Spartan, Tough Mudder, all those kinds of things, even the rise of UFC, like there's a Wim Hof, there's a craving for nitty gritty. Like, I want to actually experience reality because I'm a zoo animal. And that movement is just going to be handed to us on a plate in the coming few years.
I think there's another element to this where we have gotten used to just like sensory overstimulation in everything. Everything has to be extreme. It's either extreme collapse and it's horrible and panic, or it's extreme utopia and everything is going to be perfect and technology will solve it all. And in reality, things are usually kind of, halfway.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, well, actually, was there a question you wanted to ask? Or was that more just an
Not a question, just a comment.
Yeah, and look, I mean, again, exponentially worse, exponentially better, and mapping the intersection of two exponential curves is a son bitch, and I think, basically you're like, hey, can the Kuznets curve of, technological innovation, increasing cascade of rising standards of living, right, decreased pollution, etc., can that curve catch humanity before the thermic carrying capacity of our ecosystems tanks? After we a century ago stuck straws in the ground and siphoned out millions of years of buried starlight in the form of carbon and sprayed it all over the surface of the planet, lit it on fire. We're like, woohoo! Like, we can move matter around at unprecedented scales. If you think about the pyramids, right, every single goddamn stone against the forces of gravity was human metabolism. You look at skyscrapers and it's all just, oil set alight. And that's just buried starlight from the nearest sun. So which of those curves are we going to get to ride is a really open question. And it's very hard for people to sort. And then when it's back to, Stephen Colbert and the Correspondence Dinner, like truthiness, right? When we feel something that feels truthy, we tend to gravitate towards it. But in reality, truthiness of, hey, there's a redemption. There's a don't despair, human sinners. In the hands of an angry God, like there's redemption. There's a happily ever after story, right? That feels so truthy to us because it's such a deeply embodied linguistic narrative structure of the entire Judeo-Christian West. We've heard it so many times that it feels resonant, but it might be wrong. And so, Peter Diamandis' current book, I've been, his feeds come across my stuff, and he's seeming almost ghoulishly disconnected. He's like a carnival barker from the future at this point, where it's like the Hunger Games. You're like, what the fuck? Like, you're blabbing about the possibilities of like whiz bang 5G. Meanwhile, the world is a light, and you're talking about like disruptions in economic earnings and like drone taxis. You're like, who gives a fuck? If we're not solving for some of these other things. And yet, If we abandon the technological innovation route, then we're 100% going to go down through the floorboards, right? If we just completely freeze the interconnected global economy. So those questions of can we boost the Kuznets curve and raise everybody up behind us? Plus, there's a super moral question of is the developed West just doing a NIMBY, shut the door behind us? Like, yes, we used nuclear power and we dammed all of our rivers and we burned all of the fuel, and now you can't, because we like polar bears, like that's a problem, right? As is the question of, hey, what's happening to the thermic carrying capacity of our ecosystems, which had a ton of slack for a really long time, and appear to be close to the edges of limits. So back to our original conversation together, which was, complexity and meaning making, ability to shoot sacred cows, and ability to digest our grief. This goes back to the top one, complexity and meaning making. Can I, via Bayesian analysis, map and model the intersection of two chaotic, interdependent exponential curves? And that's one that we're almost, and back to the utopian thinking, we can't handle that. That's too much, and we almost always lunge for our preferred certain outcome, whether that's doom and gloom or techno-utopian redemption, versus staying in the middle and being like, it's all of it and none of it, and I still must act, which is much more like Bhagavad Gita. It's Arjuna and Krishna. Like, we're going to get more insight from Krishna's discourse on this one than we are from the WHO or Peter Diamandis.
So I have a question. When dealing around groups of people that are engaged in this media common consciousness sort of thing and going off about it while retaining your sovereignty, how do you engage without help contributing to them feeling ostracized? Because a lot of the times I notice crawling into these conversations is very socially acceptable, and just letting them overtake you and the fear-based things and what have you. How do you personally deal with keeping yourself sane, I guess, while in a workplace or family and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the first thing is that there's always a weird disconnect between the people around a given topic that are the most active online and the people who are actually doing shit in the real world that matters. I mean, and this is true for backcountry skiing or kite surfing. Like, I'll go on, there'll be time for some new gear, and I'll be like, okay, what's the rad stuff, and what are people talking about? And then you're like, wait a second, you're spending, you super power poster are spending so much time online, you're clearly not actually out powder skiing or riding waves. What the fuck are you doing? You're in this meta perspective around something that's really awesome in 3D, and you're actually dorking out online about it, to the expense of actually going and doing the thing. And I would say that that's very much true in a lot of this existential risk and future planning stuff as well, is that the people who are really burning like keyboard warriors, you're like, what the fuck is your day job? And if this is really that important, how can you devote this much time to it? And so that's a question that I would have for sure, is just unplug, give yourself permission to say that life is happening outside with others, not online. Touching base, swapping information, sharing data, super valuable. But nothing of profound significance is going to be done in large numbers on social media, is my experience and opinion. So unplugging from that, not getting sucked in, is key. The next is, for me, if I strip it all down, like if you really go to the edge of the screaming abyss, of existentialism 101, this is all futile, especially if I've abandoned my utopian narrative, which was my last fingers crossed attempt, at hope, is the idea of what gets me out of bed in the morning. If I realized it's ever been thus, we're forever building and collapsing. There is no saving or fixing fucking anything, and all we're doing is showing up in our little place in history to do our part. Carlos Castaneda called it, he said, the act of the sorcerer is to do the thing you know you must, with a full understanding that it is utterly pointless. He says the life of the sorcerer is one of controlled folly. And that feels about right to me. Controlled fucking folly. You're like, okay, I get it. I get the odds are slim, and there's a lot of this that's going to be utterly futile, and the tide will come and wash away our best carved sandcastles. And yet, I'm going to build that sumbitch anyway because it's beautiful. So for me, you asked, how do I stay sane? We boiled it down to three things, which is like, and this is literally like, I can say this with a smile and make, there's a few punchlines involved, but it's bleak to stare over the edge, with a really unfiltered perspective. And so for me, what gets me out of bed is seeking novelty, making art, and helping out. Like, and if you think about it, like seeking novelty, like we are hardwired dopamine seekers, and dopamine, we get the rewards specifically and extra when we seek the new, right? Not even just the familiar or the pleasant or the pleasurable, but the new and the different. So we are hardwired to do it. And when you're out in the world living new experiences, whether that's being somewhere, meeting someone, doing something physically different, we feel alive. So, okay, so part of us being alive is to learn and grow via newness. I'm down with that. The next one, make art, is literally just rail against the dying of the light. Anything I can do that isn't just leave no trace, but leave it better than I found it, right? That is defeating, however temporarily, the second law of thermodynamics, right? Leaves me in that sense of affirmed existence. Like Kilroy was here, like all those World War II soldiers, that were like, they would just scribble it. They like don't know if they're going to be alive in the morning, but they would pencil it in on the walls and the fences of Europe. Kilroy was here, like I fucking exist. So make art, right? Rail against entropy. And then finally, help out. We're social creatures, and if I can do the first two and share that in any way that catalyzes, right? Then, A, decent human thing to do. B, helper's high, right? The hedonic paradox is I don't find happiness by seeking it, right? And helper's high is one of the strongest ways into group flow or group coherence, which is turning around and lifting others up. Those three things get me out of bed in the morning, even on the grimmest days. So for me, that's kind of a transcendental existentialism, right? Which is the idea of like existentialism, like Camus 101, the only serious question is whether or not to commit suicide, and the transcendental part, and there is magic and mystery to be had. So can we hold those two things? And so for me, what feels like some version of this emergent movement, I just had this thought maybe last week, was with Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and that crew, they, like early 2000s was kind of the new atheists, right? And that was the idea of like kick down the straw man of superstitious old school religion, basically advocate for a quite cynical, rational materialism, right? And just demolish everything else. And what feels like we're all kind of living into these days is a bit of a not the new atheists, but the new Platonists, where there is that sense of the mystery, the sense of the numinous, and we include it in our rational empirical discourses. And to me, that feels like a helpful balance, because where that movement might have felt a little hollow, like there's glee in kicking down the old stuff, but there's not a lot of joy in what's left. The new Platonist, and I would include Jason Silver, I'd include Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Brett Weinstein, Eric Davis, Douglas Rushkoff. There's a number of people that are in this neck of the woods, even Sam Harris after his 5 grams in Silent Darkness, right? They're coming around, right? They're like, oh shit, okay, so there's some things I have to reckon with, and I have to integrate and include in my way of being and in my sense making. By the way, why the fuck do we call it sense making these days? Couldn't we just call it making sense? Isn't that how normal humans have syntactically rendered that sentence? That's the thing, right? Like making things extra clever for the sake of it seems to be missing the root human opportunity and invitation. And I think that transcendental existentialism, new Platonism, whatever, potentially gives us a way to close those, integrate them, galvanize ourselves. Because if you just do the existential bit, we'll get beaten to our knees. There's too much suffering. This is the digesting the grief part, right? There's too much bleakness, uncertainty, and meaninglessness to be had. very hard to prevail through that. But if we have the transcendent element, which is, holy shit, I do understand, I do feel and experience at a somatic level, grace, joy, insight, inspiration, even if it is only fleeting, because I understand that too, right? I can stretch my bones and I can get back to the hard things. So for me, that's the back and forth. That's the dialectic that, keeps me going, but hopefully not, not in too diluted fashion.
Hey, Jamie, can you get up on the mic a little bit more, or like turn the gain up a bit?
What's happening. I'm kind of eating the mic, but I will. Let me try turning up the volume. Did that help at all?
Doesn't seem to be a difference.
Huh.
Whatever you're touching, I think that's where the microphone is. So that mic might not be engaged.
Yeah. Did that help any better? Or is it still quiet? Still quiet. Check.
Yeah, still quiet.
Still quiet. Okay. How's that? Is that any better?
Still quiet, I think.
Okay. Well, let me just see about.
You might check your Zoom settings to see if you have a choice of mic.
Okay. I think let's just check
Oh,
that.
there we go.
That's better.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, okay. And then I need to start video. How? So
Yep.
I'm back. Is that better?
Yep. Yeah, I think it was. We weren't going through the other mic.
Yeah. Awesome. It was on, but not connected.
Yeah. So what you were saying was, someone made a good comment here: seek novelty, make art, help out. I noticed there is no mention of shoot the sacred cows, like you had mentioned. We talk about this a lot in the group. Like, we call it throwing it in the fire. And this has become such a central topic in our whole conversation and what we're doing in Future Thinkers. I'm wondering where this has a place for you, and if you think it's should be in that set of steps you listed.
Basically, the sort of hold no cherished outcomes kind of play.
Yeah,
like what
and the same
things?
thing is like being attached to the utopian vision. It can be attachment to a lot of different things, but I would say the stoicism would be the response to it.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, if again, somebody's asked me and I'm like, well, like what's my whatever lineage or historiography? Like what do I think structurally? And it's kind of a Neoplatonic, Stoic, Gnostic, mystic, Christic neck of the woods. And that the Stoic part is essential, right? Which is suck it up, fat kid. Do the hard thing. Nobody promised us a rose garden. Like that whole thing. I mean, I spent 25 goddamn years trying to solve the universe, like devoting huge amounts of processing power to trying to solve the meaning of life. And I was sitting on our dock, like 6 months ago. And I was, and I'd gone through, there were some really hard things happening. I had lost some friends, like some deep pain I was in at the time. And I was like, wait a sec. I was like, whoever said this thing pencils out with no remainder? Like, I had been trying to solve the universe based on the assumption it was solvable. And that was a weirdly powerful epiphany, which is just that idea of like whizzy fucking wig. What we see is what we get. And that undoes a huge number of just so stories we have been told and tell each other. And if we just accept that, back to that notion of agonistic liberalism, even, right? Or like playing the infinite game, any of these things where you're like, there may not be a happily ever after. There is a forever striving, struggling, gaining, losing, ebb and flow of life. And sitting in that, if you go from, I was deeply invested in the happily ever after just so stories, to they're all full of shit, the drop can leave you in existential despair, But if you can survive that drop and then you can get back up, then you are arguably in a deeply empowered place. Now, also be aware that like that loss of that, that's where the Joker shows up. That's where Marlon Brando and Apocalypse Now shows up, right? That's where Sith Lords show up, right? If you go from it is all meaningless, nothing matters, morality is just a comforting old wives' tale we tell to keep us, to keep the wolf from the door, then people at that point can be amoral, right? And then just choose to be agents of chaos, which is why socially we're so terrified of that move. But if you actually, and Aleister Crowley, throw him in there too, right? But if you can go through that experience and then stand back up and enter the art of controlled folly, enter Arjuna and Krishna, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But your redemption lies in the fulfillment of your Dharma. So go do that. There are no cherished outcomes. And this is why I think MLK, why Gandhi, why Emerson Thoreau, revered the Gita so much as an instructive text for transformational leadership, which is the time for cherished outcomes is long gone or maybe never existed. But you don't get to suck your thumb, sulk, or withdraw from the battlefield because it's not going to play out the way you want it. Of course, it cannot. Structurally, mathematically, it's not going to play out the way we want. But we have to play our part fully anyway. So for me, that is a way to both kind of embrace the sacred cow barbecue, where you're throwing the things on the fire, right? And at the same time, not collapse into despondency.
There's a part of this that I can't help but look at the Joker and look at the other figures that you mentioned that seem to be agents of chaos and nihilism, that there's still an attachment to things being good and a differentiation between good and bad and attachment to good. And their response to it seems to be more about show the world its own dark side, be a reflection of its dark side. So it still seems like an attachment that can be chucked in the fire. It's just not a complete job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, on that notion, Philip K. Dick has, I think, the most, at least for me, the most interesting breakdown of all that, where he's like, look, we're all plural forms of God, like we're just snippets of spark, and that's the yang element, right? And the yin element is embodied earthbound stuff, but it doesn't know itself. As the yang experiences the yin forgetting itself, it chooses. He basically says, look, this is a little known philosophy in the West, but it is known. It's known. It's called the Great Blasphemy because he's like, we didn't sin. Like the whole sense of separation, fall from the garden that's so deeply encoded. We didn't sin. We chose this. But here's the thing: when the yang element opts to come back down so that it can bring remembering or anamnesis to the yin element, it forgets itself. And he says it's a terrible irony that in choosing to come down, we forget what we are in our true nature to immerse ourselves in the soup. But in doing so, we then redeem and reawaken the yin element, including the shadow, which then takes its rightful place, not in separation as evil, but in its rightful place as part of the balance. And then we become what he calls, he uses fancy ass terms, but he calls them homoplasmates, which is basically, twice born humans. So we're in human form, in biological lifetimes, with the knowledge, the Gnostic initiatory knowledge of our true nature. And in doing that, we remake the world. So for me, that seems like a pretty, I'm willing to sign up for that game, even if it too is just a helpful lie. Directionally, I think it leaves room for novelty, for art, for service, and therefore I'm down with it, and there's another one about the wounded king, like the Fisher King in the Grail legends. And he's basically just saying, hey, by opening up to the suffering of the world, right, we take on the wound of the world, but by allowing others to touch these wounds of light, right, then we acknowledge and affirm for ourselves and everyone that all wounds are only love longing to be recognized. So can we open up to all of this as it is without breaking? Which is effectively the path of Christ consciousness, which is a weird one because it's got such shitty branding, you know? But if you really think about it, like Kairos Chronos, like how do we stay awake and aware at the intersection of sacred time and clock time without flinching, in testament to the capacities of the human experience and condition? Is that potentially transformative? Is that satyagraha? Is that soul force? And is that the element that we're actually searching for as we're all talking about group coherence, as we're talking about asymmetric cultural evolution, if we're talking about all the X factor of how we're going to do this together? You know, to me, I've kind of whittled it down to it's satyagraha or bust. Like it's either a bunch of people stepping into their courageousness and their creativity, their connectedness, or we're stuffed.
There's an interesting notion here. I'd like to just go a little bit. It's interesting because as I was listening to the recent conversations you've had, especially with Kronos and Kairos, and I've been thinking about finite and infinite games. There's something about the Flow Genome, which is a really beautiful illustration of that. You know, from some place where I have resources to start a new game, a new finite game, stepping into it, as you said, I forget my infinite nature to put myself in a limited mindset of going through that. So I put myself in a Chronos time limited reality to try to do something. And at the point that I'm actually running at the end of that game, to panic and think, oh my God, I'm at the end of my life, rather than surrender to the Kairos realization again. Oh, wait a minute, this game isn't, you know, if I play a game of chess, once I'm checkmated, it doesn't mean I never can play chess again. It means, what lessons did I learn? How do I let that insight, not the loss, impact me, but the insight of what I learned from that go to Kairos time to really think about it. But there's something else that's a really intriguing notion of that. I don't know if you've seen the TED talk by Guillaume Neri, the free diver who narrates his descent and ascent. There's something of the last phase of flow that really captured me in the Flow Genome. That last part after the flow, when you are basically integrating and reacclimating, reabsorbing all of the stuff, you know, there's a way of that time can be the sense of deepest despair, the dark night, right? You've burned up all the neurochemicals, and that's the time that it's least beneficial to actually engage in strategy and trying to get somewhere. It seems like, and Neri talks about that as he's ascending, he goes through a nitrogen narcosis as he's arising, and all he can do is stay at the present moment. If he thinks to look to the surface or what he's going to do to get out of this situation, he'll panic, and he can't do that. He has to stay right there, present moment. And I think that's kind of the processing grief, right? That's the digesting grief of, here I am right here. This, whatever this all was up to, it's done now. And all I can do is wait till I'm resourced again enough to do something again. I don't have resources now to do anything else. So I'm curious, that informs a lot of my own sense of how to engage in a flow practice. And does that fit with your sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's Ecclesiastes 101, right? I mean, to everything there is a season, right? And a time for every purpose. So allowing ourselves the ebbs and flows, super helpful, unavoidable. You only suffer more if you ignore it. And then there's also kind of something interesting there, which is the notion of ecotones, right? It's not even that there's a desired final and stable steady state. There's not. What we want is range and fluidity and flexibility in moving between those states. So it's not like, oh, I just read a thing on alpha waves or endorphins or dopamine or delta waves or, you know, vagal nerve tone or whatever the fuck, right? It's all of it in a fluid range that adapts to our environment and our goals. That is arguably a much more functional definition of enlightenment than any sort of fableized end state. The ability to match state to task. And as we move through the water column, right, as we move through the different physiology, that's where we get contrast. I'm subject object, right? If I'm subjectively in beta wave, cortical function, default mode networking, blah, 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 I don't know I'm in it until I take some breaths and I'm actually out into alpha. And I'm like, oh, and in this moment, this transition is where I become suddenly aware. I was here in the hamster wheel of my mind, and I'm now no longer. So in the same way that forests and meadows, there's all the life that grows there, tidal pools and beaches to oceans, the ecotone, the edge habitats is where we get all the contrast and where we get most of that useful and actionable data. So you're like, oh shit. So now I'm not clambering, back to the utopian thing. I'm not lunging for a fixed outcome happily ever after. I'm enjoying the ride, and I'm enjoying the contrast, and I'm developing and training flexibility and recovery to be able to move through these things. And then you realize, oh, this is polarities management 101. It's the backing and the forething that gives us the insight, the learning, and the actionable data, which is basically, not to get, overly crude, but I mean, Hinduism 101, it's the cosmic fuck. It's the backing and the forething, right? That is the bliss fuck crucifixion. It's both what feels good and what exposes us to insurmountable amounts of grief. And it's both, and it never stops. So let us live into like being fucked by life, right? Which is both profoundly pleasant, to the point of ecstatic, and profoundly agonizingly human. And if we can do that without flinching, and we can do that in connection with courage and creativity, then, what would life be like? And who would we become? And what's possible then?
Are you familiar with the work of John Vervaeke?
Yeah, John and I have actually had a couple of calls together as well.
Cool. Yeah, because you mentioned Neoplatonism, but you didn't mention him in that list. A lot of
Oh, yeah, for sure. Add him.
Alexander, do you want to pop in your question there?
Hi, Jamie. It's Alex here from Cape Town. All the questions that I had have been ended up of a field of dead cows. It's so what's still left out of what I really wanted to ask you is, talking about John Vervaeke's work, where he discusses a lot of psychotechnologies, and he is kind of speaking a lot about them being put together into an ecology of practices. And I think I'm still trying to figure out what that actually looks like. And I think, if I see your work, and I've been watching you over quite a long period of time, I think ever since your talk at Venice Beach, that TEDx talk, I've seen how things have changed quite a bit. But I've also seen in your more recent work, in that talk with the Sacred Plant Medicine talk, where you, together with John Vervaeke's work, there seems like an amazing ecology of practices forming there, but I still can't see what that actually looks like for the individual and in groups like this, but also practices for the individual that help one grow through what we've just been talking about, growing up, actually.
Yeah. Well, quick question. Let's just do a time check. How long do I have to answer this question?
We have no rules, as long as you want. Did we book for 2 hours? Or I guess I can just ask Jamie.
I don't know what we did. Let me just make sure I don't have anything else coming up. Yeah. Okay. So I'm for sure good to answer this question.
Okay.
Okay. So Alexander, beautiful framing. Thank you. And I mean, what I'm hearing you is like, is there a secret sauce? Is there a protocol for self-initiating into anthropos, like homegrown humans, like the integrated homoplasmates, as PKD would have called them? And the short answer is, yeah, fuck yeah. There absolutely is. And it's what we would call the hedonic yoga of becoming. And it's based on, I mean, basically, if you pursue basically the intersection of kind of cutting edge neuroscience and optimal psychology, you know, as it equates into biohacking, like that neck of the woods, if you pursue it open-mindedly and without flinching or being squeamish, it ends up in a psychosexual tantra. It just does. And if you go through all the wisdom traditions, they all did too. Right? There's not an esoteric tradition out there that under enough rugs you don't get to sex magic. And the reason for that is because, as John Lilly discovered back in the 50s, right, is that the human ecstatic nervous system maps one-to-one with the sexual arousal network because evolution is efficient. And if you think of the fact that we, for millions of years, have managed to reproduce with no instruction manual, would suggest that there's insane amounts of very, very strong evolutionary biological encoders to precipitate and enforce and encourage those acts, along with respiration, right? That respiration is another one that is massively, imprinted in our systems. Now, good news, bad news, the majority of human suffering is to do with our sexuality. Rape, trauma, incest, unwanted children, you name it. Like if you just get under the hood of human dis-ease and trauma and suffering, I mean, majorities derive from that. So on the one hand, huge amounts of grief around us being pulled by the puppet strings of our biological encoding, but also massive potential if you can isolate it from the amoral evolutionary impulse. Doesn't give a fuck who we fuck. All it cares about is the viability of gene pools. So never mind our social norms and custom, never mind our relational preferences and contracts, never mind any of it, right? Evolution just wants robust genetic propagation. But if you can judo that move and use that as a base layer in a hedonic yoga of becoming, which is basically saying, how can I harness and precipitate neurophysiological ecstatic experience, right, in service of trauma relief, defragmentation, and integration, such that my nervous system and my psychology and my relationships can all continue to become increasingly stable, anti-fragile, clarified, and high bandwidth. Then what might that do as far as a path of human becoming? So so the end game, I mean, I don't think we have time to map it fully, but if you can basically picture where you just kitchen sink the living fuck out of all of it, you're like, okay, so have a special friend because you need a consenting partner. You can there's for sure solo versions of this kind of practice, but having a practice partner is just more. It's more effective, it's more able, it's more meaningful, it's those kinds of things. But if you basically said, okay, what does a sexual yoga look like? It looks like Thai massage, deep body work, somatics. It looks like breath work. It looks like fascial openings. I mean, but this is basically becoming Vitruvian human, right? So you're doing all of it. There's no skipping steps. It's breath work to precipitate parasympathetic arousal. It's vagal nerve stimulation. It's stacking endorphins, dopamine, et cetera. It's also shamanic psychedelics. So basically, if you just said, hey, we're going to light the candles, put on super vibey music, have your special friend, and engage in extended body work, psychedelic journeying, breath work, and cultivated orgasmic release with eye tracking, tongue movements, tremor release, spinal undulation, pelvic mobility, right? And all these things. And basically you cultivate orgasmic energy, time and coordinate it with music, with breath work, and with all the other stacks, pulse it through the system, light up the human nervous system such that you both have access to the Neoplatonic ideal realms. So ideation, cognition, sense making, pattern recognition, even direct inspiration is maxed. At the same time that you're getting information on, here are the blockings in my nervous system and my physiology. And so the energy of the peak state orgasmic release can both inspire and inform, like, oh shit, anamnesis, didn't know that, didn't remember that, now I do remember it. But also, like an electrician putting voltage through a circuit and being like, here's a crimped wire, here's a blown fuse. I now have information as to where my blockages are. And I also temporarily have energy to rework or reformat my neurophysiology and even my memories. Then you're in an interesting place. And that's congruent with what MAPS is doing with PTSD research on MDMA. They're like, hey, you're high prolactin, high vasopressin, high oxytocin. You're in a state of satiated safety and belonging. And, Rick Doblin, their founder, has said, memories we think of are like scrapbooks we take off a shelf, we look at, we put back on the shelf. And he's like, that's not it at all. What we actually do is we take them out, we look at them, we rewrite them, and we put them back on the shelf. So you can then engage in retroactive, imaginally layered trauma relief, where you can go back to your own life and you can reformat in that state, right, of enoughness and belonging. And the other thing is that when he correlated that prolactin, vasopressin, oxytocin physiological profile of MDMA trauma, patients, he said the closest we have is to the post-orgasmic state. And you're like, okay, well, you can go schedule one, 30 years, really fucking hard, highly controlled, or how else could we get people to a post-orgasmic state? Let's see. And Nicole Prousey at the Kinsey Institute is actually doing research on exactly that, on actually validating women's orgasm as prescription pharmaceutical, right, as a replacement for drugs with side effects and all that kind of stuff. So as soon as you kind of get in this neck of the woods, you're like, oh, that's probably the most compact, high leverage, open source, scalable stack of modalities that we can combine to effectively discharge both historic biographical trauma, meaning I've taken some hits that I still have in my system and I haven't been able to get out. They impinge how I move and how I am in my life, as well as real time. So ideally, we try to get to the present. We try to metabolize our past grief to get to the deep now in our bodies, in our minds, and in our whatever we would want to call post-conventional experience and selfhood. And then can I do my level best to stay here? And if I can be sourcing from the deep now, right, that arguably would be the Kairos Chronos crossroads. And if I can then have a recurring practice, daily practice, weekly practice, monthly, seasonal, annual, where I know I can catch myself, where I know I can experience anamnesis, the forgetting of the forgetting, the remembering of true nature, true purpose, essence of being, then, and this is critical, then I'm free. Then I'm free to play full out. So instead of having a peak experience, having a breakthrough experience, going into the world naively thinking I'm going to change it, but it really just kicks the shit out of me. People just don't play fair and the world doesn't want to change. And then I subtly end up with this subject-object duality again of like, I'm pure or trying to stay loving and groovy and the world sucks and fuck the haters. Or when's my next retreat? Or when's my next float tank? Or I need to do twice as much meditation, or what have I heard about ketamine therapy, or whatever, right? Any seeking that this moment isn't enough, right? I've created a prophylactic relationship. I'm trying to protect myself from a dirty world. So it's crypto-puritanism. That's problematic for most people on the spiritual growth path. They're forever washing themselves clean, thinking they're going to fix things, and then getting hammered, and then subtly resenting or resisting the world as it is. But if you have a recurring hedonic engineering practice that's periodized, daily, weekly, monthly, seasonal, annual, and you have to test this to the point where somatically you trust that shit's going to boot me up. Like all I got to do is drag my broke ass to the doorstep of the temple and I will be remade and remembered, literally. Then you fucking lean into your dismembering. You're like, let me just do a swan dive into the swamp. It doesn't matter how dirty I get, because I know I can go down to the river to pray, right, and be washed clean again. And so that is a fundamental shift in how we show up in that sort of nominal bodhisattvic vow.
right? Which is fuck it, right? Like let me lean in, let me look for hand grenades to dive on, rather than trying to preserve or protect myself for a later date. And then I think we have, and then we're not seeking, back to the utopian escape hatch, we're not seeking or banking on some redemptive eschaton. We're showing up fully realized in this lifetime, in this moment, as it is, as Anthropos, which is not that, hey, you know, there's hyperspace and multidimensional machine elves, or there's baby Jesus, or there's anaconda spirit, or guardian angels, or whatever the fuck. It's saying, hey, the miracle isn't that we're starlight dressed up as matter. The miracle is that momentarily, for a handful of decades, we're Homo sapiens with prefrontal cortexes and spinal columns and erogenous zones and opposable thumbs. Holy fuck, that's amazing. This is the amazing part. This is the miracle. The timeless numinous is table stakes. And so that's that esoteric notion of being a twice born human. Is that we come back to that remembering and we act from this place as if this is the miracle, not the other way around.
Wow.
Which
sorry,
fucking
David.
hurts, by the way. I mean, truth in advertising, getting to that, it costs, is T.S. Eliot, right? Costs not less than everything. But once you're there, there's nothing that can be lost.
Jamie, I just wanted to check real quick on the time. I think we were understanding it was 2 hours. Do you have to go before that? Or are you?
Look, I'm enjoying this conversation. So let's take it as it needs to. How's that?
Sounds good. I'd like to follow up on just what you said. There's something interesting in noticing the sex part of it, and in particular thinking about Nicole Daedon and One Taste, and very powerful at the beginning, kind of got in trouble and flamed out. But in some sense, I think that we miss something if we don't go back and say, okay, what lessons did we learn? How do we go back and do this again? Let's take two, step back and say, where are the challenges? And in some way, I think part of it is, you know, this ties in another notion that you've said, don't take the red pill until you absolutely have to. But once you do, fully commit, right? At the same time, we want to get as many people through the gate as possible, but we don't want to encourage people to take the red pill before it's their time. And we want to be able to do the kind of step back, reassess ourselves at the collective level. How did this entity go through? You know, you also mentioned the 1,000 fires, so that at least one of them or a couple of them makes it through. So Nicole Daedon One Taste was a fire. What did we learn from that, right? Your work is a fire. John Vervaeke's putting together stuff that's a fire. There's a lot of these that are starting to be this open source, what we're looking at and trying to build the ecology of practices. But the real feedback is, hey, if it flames out, what happened? How do we assess as a group? What can others learn from that? What can the participants learn from that? How do we re-engage so we don't drive the car off the cliff in the same point again, as you so often point out? You know, so it seems that if we throw that whole practice away, we're actually throwing away massive learning opportunity to go again with a slightly different take on it. Thoughts on that?
So many. Yeah. So, and for folks that aren't familiar, Nicole Daedon was a sort of sexual philosopher, educator. I mean, still is, but she sold out of the business and is lying low for a while. And orgasmic meditation was an adaptation of a specific, even though they said it's non-sexual, it's fucking sexual. It's the stroking of a woman's clitoris for 15 minutes with a focus on breath, awareness, attention. So sort of somatic experiencing versus goal-directed climax or something like that. And the intention was that it was partitioned or firewalled off from reciprocal couples play or sexuality. It was considered a distinct and discrete practice. So as that, I think it's super useful. The interesting thing where it gets problematic is anytime you have ecstatic or cathartic technologies, psychotechnologies, right, where you're either sending people to the moon or you're breaking down all their defenses into some form of profound healing, you end up with cultic tendencies. You end up with the erosion of sovereignty, and the tendencies for groupthink, the tendencies for inflation of the hierophant or the facilitator or high priest, whatever you want to call that, and a lot of very predictable patterns, of which they fell into many. And they also adapted Tony Robbins' pricing business models, as well as landmark style high pressure closing. So basically, I mean, one of the things that we're seeing these days is there's a number of people that are sourcing from source, right? If we go to that, Neoplatonists or New Platonism, but with a fairly low bar for who gets in, you just say a lot of people are basically mixing and matching their joyrides or expeditions into the numinous and coming back into the world. And the question becomes is, how do we all live on that light? How do I have social structures? How do I have professional livelihood, right? How do I build an organization or a platform or a base around these things? Tim Ferriss is doing it in a certain way. Sam Harris is doing it in another. Dave Asprey's selling butter and coffee, right? Jason Silva gets sponsors and he just does his inspirational shots of joy. You know, Aubrey Marcus at On It is selling supplements, right? Everybody monetizes. You know, you guys are like different podcasters are like, now we're going to be teaching people, right? Everybody's trying different ways of basically metabolizing starlight. How do we do this? And we all have, you know, Jordan Peterson with Patreon, you name it, right? Everybody's trying, and none of them are exact. And we all have opinions on how everybody else is doing it based on our own value set, ethics, and even petty jealousies, right? I mean, you name it, right? We all have opinions. So let's just acknowledge that. For starters, which is metabolizing starlight is a trick, especially in a contemporary place where wisdom is captured in the spiritual marketplace. And how do we do this well and right and with integrity and with a minimum of distortion of signal that we're actually trying to bring through? Now, that said, one of the things that showed up most strongly, the actual technology of 15 minutes of clitoral stimulation for a woman can be profound on a number of levels. Not the least is the neurochemical cascade. There's the regression and the revisiting of past trauma. There is the integration and owning and accepting of pleasure, the breaking of knee-jerk reciprocity, right? There's 1,000 things that are profoundly beneficial to both participants, masculine and feminine. That said, we end up in the 80-20 upside down of regressive catharsis being mistaken for progressive development. So if I have a backlog of unintegration and or trauma, and you give me a new experience or psychotechnology that puts me down into that space, I get 80% of my learning and my breakthrough from my first 20% of exposure to that practice. And that could be circling, it could be voice dialogue, it could be, you name it. There's a lot of different psychotechnologies. Orgasmic meditation was an obvious high octane one. But then I make the mistake, and it makes total sense, right? If just in my body, I had 80% impact from 20% first crack, I don't know I'm on an upside down Pareto curve. I'm just like, holy shit, that was amazing. I want more of it. But it's a diminishing long tail like heroin, right? Where I keep chasing that original high, but I'm likely never to quite get back there. So that's where we've proposed the notion of like 80-20 woke to broke, that idea of like, look, all of these things, all of these psychotechnologies do exactly that. And then having to invest 80% more time and resource to get the diminishing long tail of your 20% leftovers becomes inefficient and even unconscionable if you could be in service helping others that are just struggling to get their head above water versus you spending all that extra time and money to get your head above the clouds, which, back to the utopian thing, is a fucking pipe dream in the first place. So don't bother. And then, the other part is just the classic Ken Wilber 101 of the pre-trans fallacy. Don't mistake getting in touch with your orgasm, which is necessary and vital, with saving the world. Right. And so a lot of regressive cathartic practices in communities are mistaking the necessary regression they're facilitating with progression, which it's not yet.
I'm seeing what you said.
There's
Oh, go ahead, David.
there's a really beautiful thing here that just pops out as you're saying that, which is learn to crawl before you walk, learn to walk before you fly, learn to fly before you strap a racket to your ass, right? And there's something like the powerful psychotechnologies, as tempting as they are, sex therapy or ayahuasca, learn simply to sit with meditation, or as you said, circling or voice dialogue or something that is, can I process grief through minor amplitudes of the flow cycle reliably, and then can I walk other people through that? There's something like, how do I do the in John Vervaeke's way, the Eros way, the consumptive? Okay, I'm going to be a participant, take this on. Move to Philia. Okay, now I'm going to help my buddy go through something similar at the same scale. Then I can up level and maybe eventually bring other people up and give back as I learn. But the attempt to shortcut it by jumping to the highest octane stuff right away is likely we're not going to be able to even metabolize. We're going to be getting so much all at once that we're only going to be able to metabolize a little bit, and there's going to be, with the diminishing returns, it's a real shame to have such a huge amplitude thing and not be able to metabolize all of that airtime, right, of that one psychotechnology. So there's something of the slow ramping of the psychotechnologies to increase the ability to metabolize over time. I haven't seen that perspective portrayed before, but it just seems obvious now in this discussion.
Yeah, it's basically upgrade your wiring and your fuses so that you can handle more light without crashing the system. Right. And that's linguistic, that's emotional, relational, it's neurophysiological, because otherwise I go to manic depression. I am a golden god in the second coming, or fuck it, I've stared at the screaming abyss, nothing means anything anymore. Or I experienced the first, but then it went away and slipped through my fingers, dark night of the soul. Fuck, that's even worse. Right. So how do we avoid the ceiling to the cellar and actually stably hold it? And there's also an element which feels like in the anamnesis element, which is like in a peak state, that persistent phenomenon of remembering more than we had forgotten. Like, oh, deep familiarity, deep sense of truthfulness to this. Is my sense is that the more work we do in our neurophysiopsychosocial selves, the more balanced and integrated they are, the more abiding and stable access we have for retention. So when William James was first experimenting with mescaline and nitrous oxide, right? I mean, he wrote poetically about it. It inspired the entire field of comparative religion and optimal sight, right? He's like, fucking A, man, you can see anything. You can make all kinds of sense. He stopped his search into that domain for two reasons. One is that he was concerned about what his colleagues would think. And the second was that he became sort of despondent that it was all slipping through his fingers. He's like the way the setting sun turns, gold alpenglow, snow peaks, into ashen cinders, such is the nature of trying to retain this stuff. But if you're like, okay, well, he was a completely disembodied, head on a stick, New England intellectual at the end of the 19th century with no lexicon and no sangha, no community of shared practice. What do we have now? And pen and paper as his retention mechanisms. What do we have with the entire, transpersonal psychology, humanist movement, neuroscience? We have tons more vocabulary, schema, frameworks to make sense. We also have communities where we get to share this together, which further grounds and anchors it. And we also have real-time retention mechanisms like fucking audio on our cell phones, or video shoots or anything that are much lower motor control, much lower cortical function requirements. So we can blurt and blabber and snag this starlight. We can lasso a lot more of it. And so that's the piece where even in the psychedelic therapy movement, right, people are overly privileging the pharmacology because it's so whiz bang, knock your socks off, works almost every time. And as a result, they're only now realizing, oh shit, integration matters. Oh shit, retention matters. Like, what are all the practices? And so like the good news, bad news is there's no skipping steps. There's no skipping any step, which is why the Vitruvian human sort of model of anthropos, like head, heart, masculine, feminine, left, right, up, down, agency, communion, like all of it, always, no skipping steps, and believe me, I have done my level best to wiggle off that hook 1,000 times until I finally just yielded to it. I'm like, okay, that's it, no skipping steps. So my rate limiter is my fallible human life as I'm living it to the best of my ability. There's no bypassing, which is the freedom of no escape. It's a tall order. I've literally prayed. I'm like, beam me up to the mothership. Let me do a full Elijah, or let me just write about it. And the information, what I've received is like, nah, son, like you have to shut the fuck up about anything other than that which you've experienced directly and can stably hold. And I'm like, oh, that's so hard. That's so much work. That's so daunting. But it feels like probably where we are.
Heather and John, I wanted to kind of swing it over to you guys if you've got anything to ask here, because we've got half an hour left and you've been pretty quiet so far.
John, do you have anything? I'm sort of, maybe, I'm not sure.
You're muted, John. There, I just unmuted you. Go ahead.
Great. Also, just quickly, so I'm working on something that's about as 1 foot off the ground as you can get. What can we agree on? So I guess my question to you is what do you think most of us can agree on, and we can get started building a team together?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. That's actually been super up for me lately, because in a series of non-ordinary experiences along the lines of what we've been discussing, I've continually had this kind of flash of like, hey, like Team Human does not need to be nearly as fragmented as it appears to be right now.
Right.
And it would be kind of neat, almost like, like in middle school, maybe, where people used to do that exercise of like go into the high school gym and like, here's the planet Earth, and like, here's Mars, and then here's the sun, and like measure it out in proportional distance. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is so big. Something like that, as far as what is our sphere of concern that we can all commit to and agree to rally around. And so like circle 1 could just be, individual rights. Circle 2 could be, everybody's family should have their, children, we should care for children. We should care for, clean water, clean soil, clean air. That's not political. We want that for our kids to live and breathe in. Some people might go all the way to, we want animal rights, but not everybody's there. Some people might say, hey, let's work on human rights first. Some people might be at the national level, but not the global level. Like, and just kind of have this stepwise shell of expanding sphere and concern. And then rather than it being a pissing match of competing ideologies, is the environment stupid? No, it's social justice. No, it's, macroeconomics. You're just like, well, what do we agree on as pro-social humans? And there's so many people around the world that are deeply dedicated in their own way. They've chosen, they could be elementary school educators. They could be social workers. They could be therapists. They could be entrepreneurs trying to build good platforms for their business. There's so many different ways that humans have said, what is good, true, and beautiful? And here's my best effort at balancing this with livelihood in the world as I stumbled into it. And if we can find and valorize those commitments, and then it's just a question of like, are we at level 1 consensus, level 3, Bodhisattva, level 11? Right? It doesn't, like, let's just figure out where's our lost zone of shared alignment, and can we opt and play from there? I was thinking about that even for like global philanthropists. Like, where are you willing to stroke checks? Like, what is, what dogs do you have in this fight, as it were? And then let's just agree to play at those levels, because then that you start undoing the political pitched battles, which are usually several levels of assumptions up as to what, like, if you go down to, like Trump and Bernie are indistinguishable as they diagnose the problem, right? The system's rigged, the little man's getting the short end of the stick, right? Everyone's like, yes, 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 yes. And then, and here's what we need to do about it becomes wildly divergent. And if we can walk it back to shared pro-social humanitarian commitments, that's at least a place for a third way. Although something that I have noticed in the last 6 months is and even in sharing some of our talks, like that last one I did with Rebel Wisdom about like finite and infinite games, I was absolutely expecting to get clipped from the far left for any attempt to say, hey, Western civilization might have some useful things in there. Mm-hmm. I was really where I was like bracing and ready for a useful, hopefully helpful kind of academic debate on the Western legacy. That's not where it came from at all. It came from the far right, critiquing me and dismissing me as a global secular humanist. I was like, ooh, wow. Okay. That is both new-ish and really scary. And they were articulate. These were not just like classic YouTube trolls. And I was like, wait a second, where's the ideology coming from? Like, is this Dave Rubin? Like, where is this coming from? Because this is several levels higher than what I would expect coming from random YouTube commenters, and it's articulate, and they pegged me, even though I was never saying any of those things explicitly. So they were able to diagnose ideological foundational assumptions and critique them from a kind of ready-made traditionalist point of view. And so that notion of the regression out of the infinite game of like global secular humanism, everybody deserves the right to play the game, to much more unapologetically and explicitly finite games of just fuck the system, might makes right, me and mine. That is that's obviously where Steve Bannon is. That's where a number of, and the resurrection of Evola as a sort of misto-fascist thinker. Like there's a lot of those movements that are happening right now that to me are the most concerning as far as an impediment to that process of, hey, where do we all agree? Can we agree to agree this far? And can we collaborate and coordinate around this much?
When I don't want to do this now, but I have software that I think can do it. So I'd love to show it to you sometime if you have them. Nice. Great. Yeah, I mean, because that would be really neat if it's just like you just check the boxes of the stuff you're in for and not into, and then just like where is consensus around anything resembling local, regional, national, international projects, and then we don't have to constantly relitigate our platforms, because the notion of how it's become almost binary on the political divides. You're either in for pro-guns, pro-life, cut taxes, fuck brown people. Like that's not actually, that's a monolith that very few actual humans have held outside of the last sort of 5 to 10 years of increasing indoctrination on, alt-right news channels. But if you look to the history of conservatism, it's been way more heterodox. And the same with progressivism. It used to be like, hey, I'm for a social safety net, doesn't mean I have to, that I'm also into like wacky pronoun clarification in every conversation, right? So there's a lot of things that have become fused by ideologues on either side. But if we tease it apart, there's a lot more shared humanity underneath it, that if we can find a way to spotlight that, would be amazing. Yeah, the signal from the noise. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll ask a question. I'm curious about with these psychotechnologies of ecstasis and catharsis becoming more powerful, more widely spread, besides the cultic tendencies, are there, I guess we've identified sort of the inability of people to metabolize what's happening to them as they go through these experiences if they're stepping out too far to start. But are there other problematic potentials that could arise around these new psychotechnologies coming into wider practice?
Yeah, all of them, just all of them. The joke in left-hand path techniques or practices, meaning like right hand is the orthodox, thou shalt not, don't put it in the ditch, and the left hand, it's all good. It's the fastest route to waking up with the lowest completion rate. So very, very, very few people have actually been able to play with fire without burning down their house. So there's a reason where you're like, and in fact, Margot Anand, who famously wrote The Art of Sexual Ecstasy and The Art of Sexual Magic, she kind of came out of the Osho community and was one of the leaders of the Neo-Tantra movement. She retired to Bali and she's teaching meditation now. So you're like, huh, okay, that's a good one to note. And, John Lilly, Aleister Crowley, like a number of the dudes who went the furthest in this space flamed out. So weaponization, commodification, and hedonization are the known present issues of anything around, because the only difference between brainwashing and Tantra is they're identical psychotechnologies. They're utterly indistinguishable. The one raises sovereignty and the other erases it. That's the sole difference. And then there's the whole lizard brain fuck monkeys of like, when you learn to press the pleasure levers better than you ever have before, the ability to just descend into addictive loops of sensation seeking is also pronounced. So in addition to the cultic tendencies, which are both, problematic on the follower and leader side. So there's two ways that can go wrong depending on who you are in that system. There's also intensive magical thinking and at a minimum sort of psychedelic Gnosticism, which is now getting and both of those are getting massively accelerated by digital media. So the magical thinking is, once I'm into the post-conventional realm, up is down, down is up, everything's an illusion, so make up one that's helpful. I get my wisdom and, spirituality from YouTube videos. I've got this mishmash of The Secret and Abraham Hicks and fucking ayahuasca fucking testimonials, and I'm just making shit up with no precision, no rigor, no logic, no discernment. So that's where we go back to Pascal, Occam, Bayes, the idea that in fact, we need more precision, more rigor, more logic, more discernment, not less, when you enter the post-conventional realms. So the whole notion of like, get out of your head and into your heart and just feel and trust. You're like, no. Back to regression, it is important to go back and reintegrate emotional somatics, because most of us are disembodied heads on sticks, but that's not the end game, right? Once we've done that, bring them together and then be a balanced human. That's super important. So magical thinking and wobbly sense making in the post-conventional realms is a huge one. Straight up sensation seeking and addictive compulsive behavior is another, because again, you've just hacked the entire reward system. And most people are like, I'd love to experience more joy and pleasure. I'm not sure it's possible. I haven't for so long, or maybe ever. I don't really believe it even exists. And you're like, no, it exists. Like, here's how you do it. Like, conduct that experiment. Works like gangbusters. And so the question is not gas. Can I get there? It's brakes and steering. And very few people have those actually fully online. It's like when they built the new Lamborghini and they put in, another 200 horsepower in the engine, but they didn't increase the brakes and increase the traction on the tires. And so drivers were just wrecking it left and right because it had more power than it had control. So that's a huge one. And then there's also the whole social, like the superego. What's the social judgment around who am I if I am a participant in those kinds of ecstatic techniques and practices? Because if I look around, the only folks who are into that are the gay community in San Francisco in the 70s, the Castro district, the BDSM and kink scene, chemsex, Vegas bachelor parties. This is debauchery and immorality, right? And so who would I be if I did that is another layer. It's kind of like the same way AIDS was just an immune virus, but the social structures, constructs, and meaning making on top of AIDS were as or more painful, problematic, and disruptive to manage as someone who was HIV positive, as just the physiological nature of the virus. So as we engage in, unfiltered integration of ecstatic techniques and practices, the question of how do we do this in a way that balances sense making, so you don't have magical thinking, balances hedonistic impulse and pleasure and sensation seeking, and reintegrates healthy superegoic narratives or meaning making around what are we doing, why are we doing it, in service of what, and what are the ethics involved. Because if you take a look at especially combinatory practices where you're actually stacking a lot of things together, you look around and you're like, oh, we're stacking 7 to 9 things. We're doing like everything we just laid out in that hedonic yoga conversation. Who does that kind of thing? Well, normally it is just purely hedonistic sensation seekers doing it unconsciously. And so you're like, oh, that's not it. I don't want to be that. We're not those people, etc. And so how does that, and then if no one we know or are aware of are doing these things, what's the roadmap? And we're seeing this in polyamory, the whole, the explosion of that book, Sex at Dawn, all these kind of books which are giving permission for people to engage in sexuality is another example, where you're like, wait a sec. If you read all of those books, What Women Want, Untrue, there's a whole kind of genre, and they're all saying the same thing. They're like, hey, neuroscience, self-servingly loose anthropology, women are lusty and everybody gets to fuck, and that's humanity, and monogamy's always sucked. Boo. All right, I mean, I'm characterizing madly, but like in a nutshell, that's why people are loving it in a popular fashion. But all of those stories are all just saying one thing. They're basically coming at it from a secular humanist sex positive frame, which is basically saying people shouldn't feel bad about natural impulses. They shouldn't judge themselves against impossible social standards, and they should feel permission to love who they want, how they want. And that's all awesome. That's, from the sex positive secular humanist side, it's rad. And it's a helpful, meaningful step forward to empowerment and choice making. But what I haven't yet seen in any of those books is the notion of, well, what happens when you really do this? And when we really do this, aren't we sneaking over the backyard fence into the realm of Tantra? Because the secular humanist sex positive is, if it doesn't harm anybody and you're communicating your needs, go for it. Right? And that's the ethical slut, and that's all those kinds of books and conversations. But you follow that far enough around and you're like, wow, we're getting into some pretty profound state shifting, heart opening, deeply vulnerable, super transformative experiences. And that might actually have some prescriptions and circumscriptions that don't show up in the sex positive secular humanist permission to do it all and try it all and experience it all. And when you get into that space, you're like, oh shit, we got a children's crusade here. And a lot of people playing with forces they don't actually fully understand, calling it liberation. But in fact, it's just throwing off, back to new atheist versus new Platonist, the new atheist, kicking down the straw man of old, repressive, prudish, socially constructed morality, but not realizing there might be a set of guidelines that are actually more important out here and actually constrain our behavior and our choices. So it's a little like if you're a skier and you're like a Yahoo snowboarder or skier, and you're ripping around the resort and you're a danger to yourself and others. And the ski patrol is like, hey, we're going to clip your ticket if you keep doing those asshat things, slow down. And you're like, well, fuck you, man, fuck the man. And like, we're going to sneak out and go behind this backcountry access gate. And we're going to be in the powder in the backcountry because we've seen those rad movies with the Red Bull guys, and that looks awesome. Right? And you're like, we're free. And you're like, no, you're not. You die out here. If you don't have the skills and the tools and the training, it looks the same. It's not the same. And so that notion of, as we take on more ecstatic cathartic techniques, and as they become more widespread and disseminated, a code of ethics to replace a code of morals becomes essential. Because really, what we've seen since the publication of Stealing Fire is a children's crusade. There's a ton of people wading in with psychedelic narcissism. So I am the light I just glimpsed. I don't remember that this is fading. I don't remember that was a state experience. I don't have the humility or the checking of being in a lineage tradition that's like, yeah, right on time. You're right here. Sit down, do your work, get back to the cushion. Like, that's all an illusion. Right? Those are cities. Those are, people are like, I'm manifesting my life in reality. And it gets sucked into like New Thought and The Secret and a bunch of narcissistic, solipsistic fucking cul-de-sacs. So we are doing it all really badly right now. And the antinomian nature of whatever we want to call this, let's just loosely call it tantric in the sense of like leaning into all experiences as raw material for accelerated development, right? It's antinomian in the sense that everyone's high on themselves and is convinced that old authority structures don't apply to them anymore. So we got a lot of people like live podcasting their own unraveling, You know, so like, yeah, we're going to Burning Man, and yeah, we've opened our relationship, and yeah, I'm experiencing 5-MeO, and yeah, we're doing all this stuff, and it's amazing. And then like 6 months later, they're like, oh shit, didn't know what we were doing. We had this total train wreck, which we broadcast live on Instagram for all of our voyeuristic followers, you know, and now really we know what's going on, but we didn't then, but we're telling you all about it. So we're being vulnerable and transparent. So doesn't that kind of count? And meanwhile, everyone's just like doing this as we try and make our way up the mountain. So I think it's a semi-controlled shit show out there. But that was just off the cuff. I don't know.
I think that that's actually a necessary part, though, right? I mean, and part of it in looking at the Game Bee discussion group on Facebook, when it does turn into a shit show, it's like, oh, but this is actually part of the learning process. There's something about it would be nice if we didn't go off and do idiotic things because of our arrogance and an uninformed way of doing things. But there's another part of this I think is interesting in that this kind of goes to the root of historically these psychotechnologies were secret, right? We kept these things pure and away from the masses because you burn down houses with this stuff. I mean, you really don't need that. But we're not there anymore. We can't anymore. And in some way, I think that that's almost evolutionary design, which is a complex kind of a thing. But over time, it looks like, oh, it is time for these things to come out. The mixing, you know, we have purified these ingredients over a couple of thousand years. We now have an internet where everybody knows everything. The ability to be transparent and put it on Instagram kind of is the warning signal, right? Oh, hey, that doesn't look friendly. But it also isn't to say, you know, there's something in that notion of exploring it, which is we're combining, but let's do this in a more conscious. I think that's kind of what this community and other communities like this are trying to do, right? Figure out how do we combine it more consciously? How do we make sure that we're not burning ourselves and others, and really be honest and transparent about where we're messing up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in best case formats like this one, right? More power to you. I think that the fact that wisdom has been captured in the spiritual marketplace, and most discerning muggles aren't. So if you've got 100,000, you know, followers and a blue check, you know, and or you're having, you know, hundreds or thousands of people at you know, at some big event, there is a perception of veracity, right, around those social signals, which are massively warped and distorted right now. So that is an issue. Another issue is the idea of, you know, this discussion of kind of group coherence and those kind of things. I mean, bottom line is most folks that are in the cultural, creative, progressive, open-minded, exploratory realms that are the ones overwhelmingly dabbling in all of these things, I think are also constitutionally spineless and prone to narcissism and solipsism. And if I speak to firemen, farmers, nurses, midwives, special operators, like anyone who actually deals in messy, gritty 3D, not the realm of ideas, not cocktail fucking fodder and reading the New Yorker, but like actually doing hard shit over time because it matters. They have a fundamentally different orientation to what we ought to do next. And in fact, you know, a guy who's a SEAL Team 6 commander who's been collaborating with MAPS had a profound experience on ayahuasca. And he's like, oh my God, that was amazing. That was 10 years of thinking in one night. I'm so grateful. Now let's get back to it. Right? And the ability to hold that and contextualize it with agency and outcome versus fetishizing it and going off down that loopy, endlessly distracting and abstracting path is meaningful. And so when I'm done. I can't talk about group coherence anymore, because talking about group coherence is like praising your kid in the hopes they develop self-esteem. It doesn't work that way. We develop self-esteem by doing hard things we didn't think we could and succeeding or failing and trying again. We develop group coherence by doing hard things together we didn't think we could, and the same. And so that notion of like sitting around being like, well, is it a dyad or a triad, or we need to presence Christ consciousness, or we need to get to a coherent field, and then ta-da, once again, utopian hockey stick, magic answers we can't come up with now will somehow emerge, non-linearly. Bullshit. Get some people together, go climb a fucking mountain, go build a home, go start a community supported agriculture, like do shit together, and we'll figure it out as we go. This a priori, angels on the head of a pin, existential scholasticism, I think needs to be clipped right now. So if there was any sacred cow to lob on the flames, it would be that pointy-headed eggheadery gets us exactly nowhere. And grab the people you love, grab the people you think you might be able to trust, find a shared objective and start building it. And that, I mean, when you talk about 1,000 fires, right, we're not like, fire requires 3 things, oxygen, a fuel source, and a spark, like stop, drop, and roll, right? We want actionable stuff we're going to remember in an adrenalized fight or flight response. And like, let's start training that stuff. It's Archilochus, right? You don't rise to the occasion, you sink to your training. So let's train together. And if we do it early enough with fun friends, it's actually play. If we wait, it's a shit show and triage.
Jamie, I'm wondering, I've had a question in my mind pretty much the whole time we've been in this conversation, and it relates to the sacred cow thing, or the kind of throwing things on the fire. I'm hearing a lot about the ecstasy and about the tantra and these ecstatic practices that makes me think it's a lot of this is just for some people is going to be like a heroin addiction. Like you've been saying, it's going to be incredibly difficult to not just blow out the lines, but go back and do the work and not get addicted to all of the shiny objects and the sugar of all of this, how these things make you feel. Mm-hmm. And I haven't heard a lot of discussion about the silent work at home by yourself in the darkness, doing, you talked about these technologies blowing out the lines. What about that slow, stoic investigation of the lines bit by bit, without any help? I mean, I just feel like a lot of the ecstatic practices thing becomes shiny object, and that concerns me.
Yeah, 100%. So once again, and this is back to utopian outcomes. Like, what are we trying to bargain to skip? And so to your point, right, even in our conversation, and we are overwhelmingly aligned, share a lot of shared frameworks, you're like, well, wait, isn't that a bargain to skip? And what did we say? We said, no, anthropos, no skipping steps. So it's amazing how dominant that signal and that mimetic structure is. And of course, if you try to skip, you slide back down the rungs, rattling your chin on every single one, and it hurts. And the higher you leap before you slip, the further the fall. It's like climbing. You can take a little fall and the rope's pretty good, but basically you fall twice the length of your last secure point, right? And so you can really take a whipper if you're not engaging that stuff. So that's why no society has ever been libertarian, because of the tragedy of the commons and rent seeking. No society has ever been left-hand path. You can't open this sort of, and do what thou wilt is the whole of the law if what thou wills is lizard brain sensation seeking, right? I mean Crowley 101 was thou was capital T, like purified, clarified, higher self. So the balance to me of the middle path on this is hedonic engineering, where you periodize and constrain access to ecstatic cathartic experiences, such that they exist periodically in your life in a way and a scale and a depth that creates momentum like a potter's wheel, right? And then and then becomes a flywheel of sustained transformation. You want now we're mixing metaphors, but you want the flame under the crucible to be at a slow simmer, not boiling over, turn it off, goes cold, boil it over, turn it off, goes cold, right? You want a slow, steady simmer such that you evaporate everything that is not pure. And that requires discipline and practice and liberation and indulgence in a structured form. So, and in fact, we can probably just share with you guys a link somewhere. Somewhere we have the instructions for an annual hedonic calendar, which is what are your daily practices, which is all the positive stoic, build your foundation. A weekly Sabbath, which is just a blip into the numinous, right? To reset and defrag my week's grief, trauma, right? A monthly day, a quarterly weekend, an annual week. And that allows me to have the big week ones, whether that's a Vipassana retreat, an ayahuasca trip, a trip to Burning Man, an ultra marathon, doesn't matter, take your pick. But some weekly, once a year, deep fucking dive that clears out the cobwebs and I am remade. Awesome. And then the other ones that keep that momentum going. And then the key there is even that's not adequate because you might have over-indexed and put too high octane practices too frequently, right? So you're getting a little soft in the head. So, and you can't even trust your practice partners because you're codependent as fuck. You're like, are you good? Yeah, I'm good. You want to go back? Yeah, let's go back, right? So you can't even trust your fellow travelers on this one. It's like if you're high altitude climbing and both of you are hypoxic and not making good decisions, like, hey, the summit looks like we could just reach out and touch it. We've come so far. Do you want to keep going? No, you have to have a turnaround time. You have to be like, if we're not up on the top by noon, we turn around no matter what. So you have to override. This is the, Odysseus lashing ourselves to the mast. So the lashing ourselves to the mast element is built-in forbearance or abstinence. Lent, Ramadan, Yom Kippur, New Year's, birthdays, take your pick, 1 month, cold turkey on all of it. And then notice the twitching, like I really like dark chocolate after every dinner. And when I don't have it, I'm missing that smackerel or something, right? I want to actually feel into the lack of all of those habits, because that, once again, to the ecotones, that's what gives me contrast. That's what gives me insight and information. And now I go back to my calendar and my sole goal is not orthodox, should I or shouldn't I, right? Binary morals. It's ethics. What's my relationship to these acts? And then it just becomes more often or less often. So Paracelsus, right, said the difference between a tonic and a toxin is the dose, right? Which you could also say, parentheses, frequency. So that's how we would propose a middle path. It's a left-hand calendaring, the hedonic engineering, with right-hand abstinence, and then just tuning up and down, where is the flame? Am I boiling it over or am I keeping the simmer going? And that's arguably like a 21st century alchemy.
Thanks for that clarification. That was exactly what I was looking for.
Perfect.
Awesome. We're right on time. Yeah, I should probably wrap up here. So, Jamie, thanks. This has been amazing, as always. This has been so good. Yeah.
I'm grateful, and I mean, I hope you guys don't mind me like playfully taking the piss out of stuff. It's in service of our own loving. I mean, wanting to critique the our massively extended community, because I feel like if we can't figure this out, the rest of the world with far less access to resources, tools, conditions, and experiences are doubly, triply fucked. So I'm extra hard on the people I love and care for the most about our shared possibility in doing something better together in service of everybody else as well as ourselves. So I hope you guys get that. And also just what the hell, taking the piss is fun.
Yeah, I would say if we're not used to it by now, we're not paying attention.
Well, it's that Zen thing, right? I mean, the closer to the gate, the fish are the dragons. And if you can't handle a little salty language on this side, you sure as hell don't belong on the other side. So we use it as a screening tool as well. It's like if you can't make it to base camp, you sure as hell on the summit bit.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right, guys.
Thank you. This was fun. Yeah. Take care.
Wow.
All right, guys. Yeah, that was awesome. We do these kind of once a month, roughly. I think we've got one booked next month. I have to double check what our calendar is. If you want to see what all of these events are, you can go to futurethinkers.org/events, I believe. If you want to actually participate like everyone else has in the video chats, you can go to members.futurethinkers.org. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Awesome.
Thank you, guys.